September 25th, 1066. The Roman road from York stretched north through rolling Yorkshire countryside, its ancient stones worn smooth by centuries of marching legions. Along this road thundered the most formidable army England had ever assembled, 15,000 men moving at a pace that would have impressed even the Romans who built the highway. At their head rode Harold Godwinson, King of England for barely 9 months, driving his army forward with an urgency born of desperation. 40 miles ahead, at a small wooden bridge crossing the River Derwent, the greatest Viking army in a generation sat unsuspecting, their armour shed in the September heat, their weapons stacked, their guard down. They had already won, or so they thought. Within hours the river would run red with Norse blood, Viking legends would die by the hundreds, and the last great Scandinavian invasion of England would end in catastrophic defeat. This is the story of Stamford Bridge, where 7,000 exhausted Englishmen destroyed an army twice their size, where Saxon shields broke the Viking Age, and where one Norwegian king's ambition died on an English spear. The events that led to Stamford Bridge began not in England, but across the North Sea in Norway, where Harald Hardrada, the hardest ruler, sat on his throne in Nidaros and contemplated the English crown. At 50 years old, Harold was already a legend. He had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, fought in Sicily and Bulgaria, amassed a fortune in Byzantine gold, and seized the Norwegian throne through a combination of ruthless violence and political genius. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, scarred from dozens of battles, Harald Hardrada was the embodiment of Viking warrior culture in its final flowering. But Norway was too small for his ambitions. He wanted England. The death of Edward the Confessor in January 1066 gave him his opportunity. Edward had died childless, leaving the English succession in chaos. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, had claimed the throne with the support of the Wittenagemot, England's Council of Nobles. But Harald Hardrada had his own claim, based on an agreement between Magnus the Good of Norway and Harthacnut of England decades earlier. The legal basis was questionable at best. Harold didn't care. He had 300 longships, 10,000 hardened warriors, and the confidence of a man who had never lost a major battle. In September 1066, his fleet crossed the North Sea in the largest Norwegian invasion force ever assembled. With Harold came Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother, driven into exile by rebellion in his Northumbrian earldom the previous year. Tostig had spent months seeking allies to reclaim his position. First, he had tried raiding the English coast with a small fleet. Then he had approached William of Normandy, who had his own designs on England. Finally he had found Harald Hardrada, who promised him the restoration of his earldom in exchange for his knowledge of English, defences and his claim to provide legitimacy to the invasion. The Norwegian fleet made landfall at the mouth of the Humber in early September, their dragon-prowed longships filling the estuary like a forest of masts. They sailed up the Ouse to Rickle, about 10 miles south of York, where they established a fortified base camp. Then they marched on York, the second city of England and the capital of the north. On September 20th, the Norwegian army met the hastily assembled forces of the Northern Earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, at Gate Fulford, just south of York. The battle was a disaster for the English. The Northern Earls, though commanding perhaps 5,000 men, were no match for Harold's veterans. The Norwegian king deployed his forces in a shield wall along the boggy ground near the Ouse, anchoring his right flank on the river. When the English attacked, they found themselves channeled into a killing ground. The battle raged for hours, but the outcome was never in doubt. Norwegian axes and swords cut through the English line. Morcar's forces, fighting in the marshy ground near the river, were pushed back and annihilated. Edwin's division held longer, but eventually broke under the relentless pressure. By day's end, the English army was destroyed. Bodies choked the marshes and floated in the Ouse. The Northern Earls had survived, but their forces were shattered. York, undefended, immediately opened its gates and offered hostages. Harald Hardrada had conquered the north in a single battle. He demanded additional hostages from the surrounding region and supplies for his army. The exchange was to take place on September 25th at Stamford Bridge, a small settlement about 7 miles east of York, where the Roman road crossed the Derwent. It seemed like a formality. The north was beaten. England would be his. What Harold didn't know was that Harold Godwinson had already been marching north for days. The English king had been in London when news reached him of the Norwegian landing. His response demonstrated the military genius that made him England's greatest warrior king. While a lesser commander might have waited to gather more forces, Harold immediately mobilised his housecarls, the professional warriors who formed the core of English military power, and began a forced march that would cover nearly 200 miles in less than 5 days. The housecarls were England's answer to Viking warriors. Armed with the famous Danish axe, a two-handed weapon capable of cleaving through shields and helmets, protected by chainmail and iron helmets, these professional soldiers were the equal of any warriors in Europe. Harold had perhaps 3,000 of them, veterans who had fought for him in Wales and against various rebellions. They formed the steel core of his army, but Harold needed more than his housecarls. As he marched north, he gathered the fyrd, the militia levy that every shire could raise in times of war. These were farmers and townsmen, less well, equipped and trained than the housecarls, but brave and determined to defend their land. By the time Harold reached Tadcaster, 9 miles south of York, on the evening of September 24th, he commanded perhaps 7,000 men, less than half of them professional warriors. He had covered 190 miles in 4 days, a feat of military logistics that would have impressed Roman generals. His men were exhausted, many were on foot, and they faced an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 2 to 1. A prudent commander might have rested, gathered more forces, and attacked when the odds were better. Harold Godwinson attacked at dawn. The English king understood that his greatest advantage was surprise. Harald Hardrada believed the north was pacified. The Norwegian king had no idea an English army was even in Yorkshire, much less camped 9 miles away. If Harold could catch the Norwegians unprepared, the numerical disadvantage might not matter. On the morning of September 25th, while Harald Hardrada and his army relaxed near Stamford Bridge, expecting a peaceful day of receiving hostages and supplies, the English army was already marching. They left Tadcaster in the pre-dawn darkness, moving silently along the Roman road. Harold had ordered his men to maintain strict silence and keep tight formation. There would be no warning. As the sun rose on a warm late September morning, Harald Hardrada's army was scattered across several miles of Yorkshire countryside. The king himself, along with Tostig and perhaps a third of the Norwegian force, about 5,000 men, was on the east bank of the Derwent near Stamford Bridge. They had left their armour at the ships at Rightful 10 miles south. In the warm weather, chainmail was uncomfortably hot, and they expected no fighting. Many warriors had shed even their leather jerkins and lay in the grass enjoying the sunshine. Another third of the Norwegian army, perhaps 4,000 men, remained at the ships at Rightful, guarding the fleet and the supplies. The final third, about 3,000 warriors, was scattered along the road between Rightful and Stamford Bridge, moving supplies or simply trailing behind the main force. The Norwegian army, formidable in battle, was divided and unprepared for combat. It was a fatal mistake. The first warning Harald Hardrada received was a dust cloud on the western horizon, visible from Gate Helmsley, about 4 miles west of Stamford Bridge. Norwegian scouts, posted more from habit than expectation of danger, rode hard to the king with news. An army was approaching from the west, a large army. Harold's first reaction was reportedly one of confusion. The northern earls were beaten. Who could possibly be marching on him? Then the realization struck. Harold Godwinson. The English king had somehow marched an army 200 miles in days and was about to strike before the Norwegians could prepare. For perhaps the first time in his legendary military career, Harald Hardrada had been outmaneuvered. The Norwegian king's response showed why he had survived so many battles. He immediately sent riders galloping south to Rightful with orders for the rest of the army to arm and march to Stamford Bridge at the run. Then he began organising his available forces for defence. But there was a problem. The Derwent stood between his 5,000 warriors and the approaching English army. The wooden bridge at Stamford was narrow, capable of allowing only a few men to cross at a time. If the English caught his forces divided on both sides of the river, they could destroy them piecemeal. Harold made a fateful decision. He ordered most of his force to cross to the west bank, where they would form a shield wall and face the English. But he needed time. Time for his warriors to cross the narrow bridge. Time for them to form up properly. Time for the reinforcements from Rightful to arrive. Someone had to buy that time. What happened next became the most famous incident of the battle, though historians debate whether it actually occurred or is simply legend. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later Norse sagas, a single Norwegian warrior volunteered to hold the bridge. This unnamed giant, armed with a Danish axe and dressed in full chain mail despite the heat, took his position at the centre of the bridge and prepared to die. The English army appeared over the western hills like an avenging tide. Harold Godwinson's vanguard, probably his mounted housecarls, reached the bridge first and attempted to cross. They met the Norwegian champion. What followed was an exhibition of what a single skilled warrior could accomplish in the age of hand-to-hand combat. The bridge was narrow, perhaps 15 feet wide, allowing only 3 or 4 men to advance abreast. The Norwegian giant's axe had a longer reach than English swords or spears. He couldn't be flanked. He couldn't be surrounded. Every English warrior who stepped onto the bridge faced him alone or with minimal support. The giant killed the first Englishman with a single axe blow that split his shield, arm and skull. The second died moments later, nearly cut in half by a horizontal strike. The third was pushed backward into the river by the force of a blow against his shield. The fourth was caught by an upward stroke that opened him from groin to chest. For perhaps 40 minutes the Norwegian champion held the bridge alone. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle claims he killed 40 Englishmen single-handedly. Later, Norse sagas raised the number to 60. Modern historians are sceptical of such numbers, but even if the true count was a quarter of that, it represents an extraordinary feat of arms. Behind him, Norwegian warriors were streaming across the bridge and forming up on the west bank. The bridge battle served its purpose. It bought time, but time was running out for the champion. According to legend, an English soldier floated beneath the bridge in a half-barrel or small boat and thrust a spear up through the wooden planking, killing the Norwegian from below. Whether this is true or the warrior was simply overwhelmed by numbers after exhausting himself, the result was the same. The bridge was taken. The English army crossed the Derwent and formed up on the east bank, facing the hastily assembled Norwegian shield wall. Harald Hardrada had managed to organise perhaps 4,000 warriors into a defensive formation on the open ground between the river and Stamford village. They had formed the shield wall, the classic Norse defensive formation, warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with shields overlapping and weapons ready. Without armour, many fighting in leather jerkins or simple tunics, they were far more vulnerable than they should have been. But they were Vikings. They would not break easily. Harold Godwinson, having crossed the bridge, could see the Norwegian position clearly. His enemy was formed up on open ground with the river at their back. There was no possibility of retreat. The Norwegians would fight to the death or surrender. Knowing Vikings, surrender was unlikely. But Harold tried. According to the sagas, the English king rode forward with a small escort and addressed the Norwegian line. He offered peace to Tostig, his exiled brother, promising to restore his earldom if he would abandon Harald Hardrada and submit. Tostig, standing in the Norwegian shield wall, called back asking what his ally Harold would receive if he withdrew. Harold Godwinson's response has echoed through history. 7 feet of English ground, or as much more as he needs, seeing that he is taller than most men. Harald Hardrada, recognising Harold Godwinson from the description and bearing, reportedly asked Tostig who the man was who offered such generous terms. When Tostig identified his brother, Harold allegedly said, "That was a little man, but he sat firmly in his stirrups." The negotiations were over. The battle would decide England's fate. The English army formed up perhaps 500 yards from the Norwegian line. Harold placed his housecarls in the centre, their Danish axes ready. The third filled out the wings, armed with spears, swords and shields. The English also formed a shield wall, the universal infantry tactic of the period. For a few minutes the two armies stared at each other across the open ground. Then Harold gave the order to advance. The English line moved forward, slowly at first, maintaining formation. As they closed the distance, the pace increased. At 100 yards, both sides began shouting battle cries. At 50 yards, the English broke into a run. The two shield walls collided with a crash that could be heard miles away. The initial impact of shield wall combat was crucial. The side that maintained formation and cohesion usually won. The side that broke or gave ground was slaughtered. The English, despite their exhaustion from the forced march, hit the Norwegian line with devastating force, but the Norwegians held. What followed was the kind of brutal, grinding infantry combat that defined medieval warfare. Shield walls didn't usually produce quick victories. They were pushing contests where the front ranks fought while the rear ranks pushed forward, adding their weight to the formation. Men in the front ranks hacked at opponents with swords and axes, stabbed with spears, or simply tried to break enemy shields with sheer force. Combat was conducted at arm's length, shields touching, weapons striking over and around the shield wall. Men fell constantly. Those wounded or killed in the front rank were dragged backward and replaced by the man behind. The fight moved back and forth across yards of ground, neither side gaining a decisive advantage. The lack of armour began to tell on the Norwegians. English spears and swords found flesh more easily than they should have. Men who would have been protected by chain mail fell to wounds that should have been superficial. The warm September sun, pleasant in the morning, became a torture as the battle raged into the afternoon. Men fighting in close formation, pushing and hacking and dying, were drenched in sweat. The unarmoured Norwegians had an advantage in mobility but were dying faster than their enemies. Harald Hardrada fought in the front rank, his height and skill making him a rallying point for his warriors. According to the sagas, the Norwegian king wielded his sword with terrible effect, cutting down English warriors while encouraging his men. Around him, the Norwegian line held despite mounting casualties. Then Harald Hardrada made a mistake. Seeing the English line begin to waver in one section, he led a charge meant to break through and roll up the enemy flank. The king surged forward with several hundred warriors, smashing into the English line with berserker fury. For a moment it seemed to work. The English gave ground. The Norwegian wedge drove deep into enemy formation, but it was a trap. Harold Godwinson had deliberately weakened that section, drawing the Norwegians forward. When Harold's charge reached its maximum penetration, English forces on both sides closed in, surrounding the Norwegian king and his warriors in a pocket. What followed was a slaughter. Caught in a three-sided trap, unable to retreat, the Norwegian warriors died almost to a man. Harald Hardrada, the legendary king who had never lost a major battle, took an arrow in the throat. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but it was incapacitating. The king fell to his knees, unable to shout orders or encourage his men. Moments later, English housecarls reached him and finished what the arrow had started. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, died on English soil. His body left where it fell as the battle raged around him. The death of Harold should have ended the battle. Viking armies often broke when their leaders fell. But Tostig Godwinson took command and rallied the Norwegians. The exiled earl knew there was no mercy waiting for him. He would die here or win here. There was no third option. The battle continued, with renewed fury. Tostig managed to reform the Norwegian line, pulling back from the pocket where his ally had died, and establishing a new shield wall closer to the river. For another hour the fighting continued. Then everything changed. A dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. The Norwegian reinforcements from Rickhol had arrived. Eyolf Thorson, commanding the forces at the ships, had received Harold's messengers and force-marched his warriors the 10 miles to Stamford Bridge. About 3,000 Norwegian warriors, these ones fully armoured and fresh, now approached the battlefield at the run. For a moment, English victory hung in the balance. Harold Godwinson's army was exhausted from both the forced march and hours of brutal combat. They had taken significant casualties. Now they faced fresh enemy troops who outnumbered them and were better equipped. A lesser commander might have ordered a retreat while it was still possible. Harold Godwinson ordered an attack. The English king understood that the Norwegian reinforcements were exhausted from their forced march. They were formed up but not properly deployed. If he struck immediately, before they could properly assess the situation and coordinate with the surviving forces from the first battle, he might break them. Harold reorganised his line, pulling his best remaining housecarls to the front and filling gaps with furred warriors. Then he led them forward personally, attacking both the original Norwegian position and the arriving reinforcements simultaneously. The gamble worked. The newly arrived Norwegians, despite their armour and numbers, were winded from their run and psychologically unprepared for immediate combat. They had expected to reinforce a holding action, not to be immediately attacked by an enemy that should have been falling back. The English assault hit them before they could properly form up. Meanwhile, Harold kept pressure on Tostig's surviving forces, preventing them from linking up with the reinforcements. The battle fragmented into multiple smaller fights across the field. In one of these smaller engagements, Tostig Godwinson fell. The sources disagree on exactly how he died. Some say he was killed in single combat with an English thegn, others claim he was simply overwhelmed by numbers. However it happened, the exiled earl's death removed the last rallying point for Norwegian resistance. With both Harold and Tostig dead, the remaining Norwegian commanders realised the battle was lost. Some tried to organise a fighting retreat toward the ships at recall, others simply broke and ran. Most died where they stood. The English pursuit was merciless. Harold's men, exhausted but victorious, chased fleeing Norwegians across the countryside. The road to recall became a killing ground. Warriors who had survived the battle were cut down during the retreat. Some tried to surrender and were killed anyway. The English were taking no prisoners. By the time darkness fell on September 25th, the battlefield at Stamford Bridge and the road to recall were carpeted with Norwegian dead. The casualties were catastrophic. Of the approximately 10,000 warriors Harald Hardrada had brought to England, perhaps 8,000 were dead or dying. The survivors, led by Harold's son Olaf, were allowed to withdraw to their ships and sail home. Of the 300 longships that had arrived, only 24 were needed for the survivors. The English casualties were also significant, perhaps 2,000 dead and many more wounded. But Harold Godwinson had won a complete victory. The greatest Viking invasion in a generation had been annihilated in a single day. The North was saved. England was secure. Except it wasn't. 3 days after Stamford Bridge on September 28th, news reached Harold in York that William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey on the south coast. The English king had just fought and won one of the most significant battles in English history. His army was exhausted and had taken heavy casualties. Now he faced another invasion, this one led by perhaps the most dangerous warrior in Europe. Harold Godwinson ordered his army south. Within 2 weeks he would face William at Hastings and lose everything. But that's another story. Stamford Bridge deserves to be remembered on its own terms, not as a prologue to Hastings, but as one of the most remarkable victories in medieval military history. Harold Godwinson had marched an army 200 miles in 5 days, achieved complete tactical surprise, and destroyed a force twice his size led by one of the most legendary warriors in Viking history. The battle marked the end of the Viking Age in England. For 250 years, Scandinavian raiders and invaders had terrorised the English coast. They had conquered much of the country during the Danelaw period. They had placed their own kings on the English throne. Stamford Bridge ended all that. Never again would a Norwegian or Danish army seriously threaten England. The age of Viking expansion was over. The tactics displayed at Stamford Bridge demonstrated the evolution of English military capabilities. Harold's forced march showed logistical sophistication rare in medieval warfare. His use of the housecarls as a professional corps supplemented by militia showed combined arms thinking. His tactical patience, refusing to be drawn into a premature attack and waiting for the right moment to strike, showed generalship of the highest order. For the Norwegians, Stamford Bridge was a disaster from which they never fully recovered. Harald Hardrada had taken the cream of Norwegian military manpower to England. Most never returned. The Norwegian royal line was secure, Harold's son Olaf succeeded peacefully, but Norwegian power was broken. Never again would Norway threaten to dominate the North Sea or challenge for the English throne. The individual stories from Stamford Bridge have echoed through history. The unknown Norwegian champion at the bridge became a legend, his sacrifice inspiring countless retellings. Harald Hardrada's death marked the end of an era, the last of the legendary Viking warrior kings dying in battle as he would have wished. Tostig's betrayal and death added a tragic element. Brother fighting brother for a crown neither would wear. But the real significance of Stamford Bridge lies in what it represented, the ability of a well-organised Anglo-Saxon kingdom to defeat the greatest external threat of the age through superior logistics, discipline and leadership. England in 1066 was not the fragmented collection of kingdoms it had been 2 centuries earlier. It was a sophisticated state with an effective military system and a king who knew how to use it. That Harold Godwinson lost at Hastings 3 weeks later shouldn't diminish his achievement at Stamford Bridge. He fought 2 major battles against world-class opponents within a month, winning one conclusively and losing the other narrowly. That he lost ultimately to Norman cavalry and archers, after his infantry had been weakened at Stamford Bridge, is more a testament to William's skill than to Harold's failure. The Viking Age officially ended on other dates, depending on how historians count. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity, the establishment of stable kingdoms, the end of raiding, All these processes took decades and varied by region. But if we want a single moment when the Viking threat to England definitively ended, when the age of Scandinavian military dominance concluded, it came on a warm September afternoon in 1066, on open ground near a small wooden bridge over the River Derwent. There, Saxon shields met Viking axes for the last time. The Vikings lost. The thunder of that defeat echoed across the North Sea and ended an age. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge reveals details that illuminate both the scale of the carnage and the nature of warfare in 1066. Local chronicles record that bodies lay so thick on the battlefield that farmers were still finding bones and armour fragments 50 years later when ploughing their fields. The River Derwent reportedly ran red for 3 days, clogged with corpses that had to be cleared before boats could navigate it. The concentration of dead was so intense near the bridge itself that the wooden structure had to be rebuilt entirely, the original timbers so soaked with blood and damaged by fighting that they were unusable. The Norwegian survivors who limped back to their ships at recall told stories that would haunt Scandinavian courts for generations. Warriors who had fought in a dozen campaigns, who had raided from Ireland to the Baltic, spoke of Stamford Bridge in hushed tones. The ferocity of the English housecarls, the tactical brilliance of Harold's surprise attack, the catastrophic unpreparedness of their own forces, all became cautionary tales about the dangers of underestimating an opponent. Eyjolf Thorson, who had commanded the reinforcements from Rickall and survived the battle, returned to Norway and lived another 30 years. His account, preserved in the Heimskringla saga, provides one of the most detailed Norse perspectives on the disaster. He described arriving at Stamford Bridge after the forced march from the ships, his men exhausted but confident they would turn the tide. Instead, they found chaos. The original Norwegian force was broken, their king dead, and the English army, which should have been retreating in the face of reinforcements, was attacking with renewed fury. Eyjolf's description of the English assault captures the shock of that moment. We expected to find our brothers holding, waiting for our arrival to crush the English between us. Instead, we found slaughter. The English king, this Harold Godwinson, led his housecarls personally. I saw him, bloodied and exhausted, still fighting like a berserker. Their axes, those terrible Danish axes, were cutting through our lines like they were wheat. We were fresh. We were armoured. We were Vikings. None of it mattered. Within an hour, we were running for our lives. The tactical decisions Harold made at Stamford Bridge deserve deeper analysis. His choice to attack immediately upon reaching the battlefield rather than resting his exhausted army contradicted conventional military wisdom. Medieval armies that had force-marched typically needed time to recover before engaging in combat. But Harold understood that his only advantage was surprise. Rest a day, and the Norwegians would know he was coming. Attack immediately, and he might catch them unprepared. This decision reveals Harold's understanding of psychological warfare. The Norwegians at Stamford Bridge were not just physically unprepared, lacking armour and proper formation. They were psychologically unprepared. They had already won the war in their minds. Gate Fulford had crushed the northern earls. York had surrendered. Hostages were being gathered. The conquest was complete except for the formalities. The sudden appearance of a Royal English army shattered that psychological certainty and created a moment of vulnerability that Harold ruthlessly exploited. The positioning of forces also showed tactical sophistication. Harold placed his best troops, the housecarls, in the centre of his line where they would face the strongest Norwegian resistance. This was standard practice, but what was unusual was how he deliberately weakened one section of his line to draw Harald Hardrada into a trap. This suggests pre-battle planning and communication with his commanders. The English army wasn't just attacking blindly. They were executing a coordinated tactical plan designed to exploit Norwegian overconfidence. The weapons used at Stamford Bridge represented the pinnacle of 11th century military technology. The Danish axe, the signature weapon of English housecarls, deserves particular attention. This wasn't the small hand axe of popular imagination. It was a two-handed weapon with a blade measuring up to 12 inches and a haft of 4 to 5 feet. In skilled hands, it could split shields, sever limbs, and penetrate chainmail through sheer kinetic force. The technique for wielding the Danish axe required extensive training. The warrior would grip the weapon at the base of the haft, swing it in a wide arc to build momentum, then slide his upper hand down the shaft at the moment of impact to maximize force. A skilled axeman could adjust his strike mid-swing, changing the angle to exploit gaps in enemy defences. The weapon's length gave it greater reach than a sword, allowing housecarls to strike over or around shields. But the Danish axe had a significant disadvantage. It required both hands, meaning the warrior couldn't use a shield. This made axemen vulnerable to missile fire, and required them to rely on their armour for protection. At Stamford Bridge, where many Norwegians lacked armour, this disadvantage mattered less. The housecarls could employ their axes to devastating effect without facing heavily armoured opponents who might exploit their lack of shields. The Norwegian forces relied primarily on swords and the single-handed axe, weapons that could be used with shields. Viking swords of this period were masterpieces of metalworking, pattern-welded blades that combined hard steel edges with flexible iron cores. These weapons could cost as much as a farm and were passed down through generations, often with names like Legbiter or Skullsplitter. But at Stamford Bridge, many of these famous weapons were left at the ships with the armour. Warriors fought with whatever they had grabbed when the alarm sounded. The psychological impact of fighting without armour cannot be overstated. A warrior in full mail might take a blow that would have been fatal and walk away with nothing more than bruising. An unarmoured warrior taking the same blow died. Every Norwegian at Stamford Bridge knew they were more vulnerable than they should be. Every blow struck against their shields, every spear thrust that penetrated their line, carried the possibility of instant death. This knowledge affected morale and tactical decision-making throughout the battle. The role of the fyrd, the English militia, deserves more attention than it typically receives. Military historians often focus on the elite housecarls, but the fyrd made up more than half of Harold's army at Stamford Bridge. These were not professional warriors, they were farmers, craftsmen, and townsmen who owed military service to their lords. Their equipment varied widely. Wealthy thegns might have chainmail and good swords. Common farmers might have nothing more than a spear, a shield, and a leather cap. Yet the fyrd performed admirably at Stamford Bridge. They held their positions in the shield wall. They advanced when ordered. They pursued fleeing Norwegians with determination. This suggests several things about the quality of Anglo-Saxon military organisation. The fyrd were not untrained rabble. They practised regularly, often at local and regional gatherings. They understood shield wall tactics. They knew how to maintain formation under pressure, and perhaps most importantly, they were fighting for their homes against foreign invaders, motivation that professional warriors couldn't match. The command structure of Harold's army also functioned effectively. In medieval warfare, maintaining control of forces during battle was extremely difficult. Once shield walls collided, commanders had limited ability to issue orders or adjust tactics. Visibility was poor, noise was overwhelming, and messengers could rarely penetrate the fighting lines. Yet Harold managed to coordinate his forces throughout the battle, springing his trap on Harald Hardrada, attacking the Norwegian reinforcements before they could properly deploy and organising the pursuit. This level of command and control suggests Harold had experienced subordinate commanders who understood his intentions and could act independently. Men like his brothers Gurth and Leofwine, who would die with him at Hastings, or various thanes who commanded sections of the line. These men could make tactical decisions without constant direction, allowing the army to function as a coordinated whole rather than a collection of individual warriors. The intelligence failure that doomed the Norwegians also warrants examination. How did Harald Hardrada, an experienced military commander, fail to detect an army of 7,000 men marching to within striking distance of his position? The answer reveals both the limitations of medieval reconnaissance and the speed of Harold's march. Medieval armies didn't have sophisticated scouting systems. A commander might send riders ahead to observe enemy movements, but these scouts could cover only limited territory and could easily miss an army taking unexpected routes. Harold had posted scouts on the roads from York, but Harold's army approached from the south, from Tadcaster, moving faster than anyone anticipated. By the time Norwegian scouts detected the English, Harold's vanguard was already visible from Stamford Bridge. The speed of Harold's march was genuinely extraordinary by medieval standards. Covering nearly 200 miles in less than 5 days required averaging more than 40 miles per day, with a large army. Roman legions, famous for their march discipline, typically covered 15 to 20 miles per day. Harold nearly doubled this pace with an army that included militia forces less accustomed to sustained marching than professional soldiers. How did he achieve this? Several factors contributed. First, Harold used the Roman road system, which provided a paved surface that allowed faster movement than cross-country travel. Second, he clearly left slower-moving elements behind, focusing on getting his fighting troops to the battlefield as quickly as possible. Third, he probably commandeered horses and wagons from settlements along the route, allowing some troops to ride while others walked, then rotating to spread the fatigue. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Harold must have maintained iron discipline, forcing men to continue marching when exhaustion made them want to stop. The logistics of this march are staggering. 7,000 men need food and water. They need places to sleep, even if only for a few hours. They need to maintain their equipment, repair broken straps and buckles, sharpen weapons. All of this had to be accomplished while moving at a pace that left little time for anything except marching and brief rest periods. The fact that Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge capable of immediate combat speaks to both the organisational capability of the Anglo-Saxon military system and the personal leadership of the king. The weather played a crucial but often overlooked role in the battle's outcome. September 25th, 1066, was unseasonably warm, warm enough that the Norwegians shed their armour and many stripped down to tunics. This warmth was fortunate for Harald Hardrada's warriors in the morning, when they were relaxing and waiting for hostages to arrive. It became lethal once the fighting started. Combat in the 11th century was physically exhausting. Men in the front ranks of a shield wall pushed and struck and defended for minutes at a time before being rotated to the rear to rest. Even this rotation didn't provide much relief. The press of bodies, the weight of equipment, the constant need for alertness, all combined to exhaust warriors quickly. Add warm weather, and exhaustion came even faster. The Norwegians, lacking armour, tired less quickly than they would have in full mail, but they also died faster when struck. The English, wearing armour, were more protected but tired faster in the heat. The battle became, in part, a race between Norwegian vulnerability and English exhaustion. That the English won this race speaks to their superior physical conditioning from the forced march, and their psychological advantage of fighting as defenders of their homeland. The bridge itself, the structure that gave the battle its name, was a typical wooden construction of the period. Probably built on stone pilings with wooden planking, it would have been perhaps 15 to 20 feet wide and 100 feet long, spanning the Derwent at a relatively narrow point. The river at Stamford was not particularly deep or wide, probably fordable in several places, but the banks were steep and muddy, making the bridge the easiest crossing point for an army. This single structure became one of the most important tactical features of the battle. It separated Harold's forces, prevented easy reinforcement, and created a choke point that one determined warrior could defend. The story of the Norwegian champion holding the bridge has become legendary, but even stripped of legendary embellishments, the basic tactical situation was real. A narrow bridge creates a natural defensive position where numbers matter less than position and individual skill. The debate among historians about whether the bridge champion actually existed illustrates the challenges of medieval military history. The primary sources, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and later Norse sagas, were written years or decades after the events they describe. They combine factual reporting with literary embellishment, propaganda, and folk tradition. Separating fact from legend requires careful analysis. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled by monks working for English kings, had every reason to embellish English victories and minimise English difficulties. If one Norwegian warrior really did hold up the English army for 40 minutes, killing dozens of men, this represented an embarrassing delay and significant casualties. Yet the Chronicle includes the story. This suggests the incident was too well known to omit, remembered by too many survivors to deny. The basic facts, a Norwegian champion holding the bridge, causing casualties, delaying the English advance, probably occurred. The specific numbers and details are less certain. The tactical situation after the English crossed the bridge illuminates the limitations of medieval warfare. Harald Hardrada had managed to form a shield wall with about 4,000 warriors on the west bank of the Derwent. This was a respectable defensive position. Shield walls were difficult to break, especially when defended by experienced warriors. With the river at their backs, the Norwegians couldn't retreat, but they also couldn't be outflanked. The battle would be decided by direct frontal assault, the bloodiest kind of medieval combat. Harold Godwinson's decision to offer terms before attacking has been interpreted various ways by historians. Some see it as genuine attempt to avoid bloodshed, others view it as psychological warfare, an attempt to weaken Norwegian morale before the assault. Still others suggest Harold was buying time for his own forces to form up and prepare for battle. All these interpretations may be partially correct. The exchange between Harold and Tostig, brothers who had once been close, adds tragic dimension to the battle. Tostig had been Earl of Northumbria until a rebellion against his harsh rule forced Harold to exile him in 1065. Tostig blamed his brother for this humiliation, believing Harold should have supported him against the rebels. The personal animosity between them was real and bitter. Harold's offer, return and be restored as Earl, was probably genuine as far as it went. But it came with implicit conditions. Tostig would have to accept subordinate status, acknowledge Harold as king, and abandon his Norwegian allies. For a proud man who felt he had been betrayed and humiliated, these conditions were probably unacceptable. Tostig had cast his lot with Harald Hardrada. There was no going back. Harald Hardrada's response to the offer, 7 feet of English ground, has become one of the most famous quotes of medieval warfare. It was both an insult and a recognition of reality. The Norwegian king understood he was being offered death, not terms. His response accepted that reality with grim humour, while also serving as a rallying cry for his warriors. They would die here, but they would die as Vikings, weapons in hand. The actual fighting at Stamford Bridge followed patterns common to shield wall combat, but with unusual intensity. The collision of 2 shield walls typically produced a grinding stalemate that could last for hours. Neither side could easily break through. The key was maintaining formation and morale while inflicting casualties on the enemy. Eventually one side would weaken, a gap would open in their line, and the battle would cascade into rout and slaughter. At Stamford Bridge, the unusual factors were the exhaustion of both armies and the lack of Norwegian armour. Harold's men were tired from their forced march, but fighting for their homes. Harold's men were fresh but vulnerable, and fighting far from home. These competing factors created a battle that was both longer and bloodier than typical 11th century engagements. The front-rank warriors in both shield walls faced horrific conditions. They stood close enough to smell their opponent's breath, close enough to see their eyes. They struck and defended and pushed for minutes that felt like hours. When they tired, they were pulled back and replaced, stumbling to the rear to collapse in exhaustion while fresher warriors took their place. The wounded who could still walk were dragged backward. The dead were left where they fell, their bodies becoming obstacles that both sides had to fight over and around. Behind the front ranks, supporting warriors pushed forward, adding their weight to the formation. This pushing was crucial. A shield wall that stopped pushing backward lost ground and eventually broke. The rear ranks also passed forward weapons and water, helped wounded men to the back, and watched for gaps in the line that needed to be filled. Shield wall combat was a team effort requiring coordination and discipline throughout the formation. The noise of battle was overwhelming. Thousands of men shouting, metal striking metal, wood splintering, the screams of wounded, the commands of officers trying to be heard over the chaos. Warriors in the front ranks fought in a nearly constant din that made verbal communication nearly impossible. Commands were often relayed by horn signals or messengers, but in the press of combat, many warriors simply had to fight based on their training and instincts. Harald Hardrada's decision to lead a charge from the shield wall was tactically aggressive but strategically foolish. Shield walls were defensive formations, their strength lay in their cohesion and mutual support. Breaking the shield wall to charge, even if initially successful, created vulnerabilities that a skilled opponent could exploit. Harold was an experienced commander who understood this. That he charged anyway suggests he saw something in the English line, a weakness, or wavering, that made him think a decisive blow was possible. The trap Harold Godwinson set for the Norwegian king shows sophisticated tactical planning. Deliberately weakening one section of his line to invite attack required confidence in his remaining forces and coordination with his subordinate commanders. The weakened section had to give ground convincingly enough to draw the Norwegians forward, but maintain enough cohesion to prevent actual breakthrough. The flanking forces had to be positioned to close the trap quickly once Harold committed his charge. All of this had to be planned and communicated before the battle started, then executed amid the chaos of combat. When the trap closed on Harald Hardrada and his warriors, the result was predictable and brutal. Surrounded on 3 sides, unable to retreat, the Norwegian warriors died in place. This type of encirclement, the pocket battle, was the nightmare scenario of shield wall warfare. Warriors in a pocket couldn't maintain proper formation. They couldn't rotate tired fighters to the rear. They couldn't maneuver or disengage. They could only fight and die. Harold's death from an arrow wound followed by edged weapons illustrates the combined arms nature of 11th century warfare. English armies included archers, though they were less prominent than in later centuries. These archers couldn't break a shield wall through firepower alone, but they could harass enemy formations and inflict casualties on exposed warriors. An arrow in the throat wouldn't have killed Harold instantly, but it incapacitated him, preventing him from commanding or defending himself. The housecarls who finished him with axes or swords were simply completing what the arrow had started. The death of a king in medieval warfare typically ended battles immediately. Warriors fought for their lords. When the lord died, especially if he died in front of them, morale collapsed. That Tostig managed to rally the Norwegians and continue fighting speaks to both his personal leadership and the desperation of the Norwegian position. They had nowhere to run. The river blocked retreat. Surrender to an enemy whose lands they had invaded was unlikely to end well. Fighting was their only real option. Tostig's continuation of the battle gave Harald Hardrada's reinforcements from Rickhall time to arrive, but it also inflicted additional casualties on forces that were already seriously weakened. By the time Eyjolf Thorson and his 3,000 warriors appeared on the southern horizon, the original Norwegian force had been fighting for 2 or 3 hours. They were exhausted, depleted, and demoralized despite Tostig's best efforts. The arrival of Norwegian reinforcements created the critical moment of the battle. Harold Godwinson faced a decision with literally seconds to make it: fall back and regroup, accepting a longer battle but preserving his exhausted forces, or attack immediately, hoping to break the reinforcements before they could properly deploy. His choice to attack immediately was the decision of a commander who understood that momentum in battle was often more important than numerical strength or fresh troops. The assault on the Norwegian reinforcements was, in some ways, more impressive than the initial victory. Harold's men were now exhausted from hours of brutal combat. They had taken casualties. They should have been incapable of mounting an aggressive attack. Yet Harold drove them forward, personally leading the assault according to several sources. This kind of charismatic leadership, where the king fights in the front ranks and inspires by personal example, was expected of medieval monarchs but rarely achieved successfully. The psychological shock to the Norwegian reinforcements was decisive. They had marched 10 miles at the run, exhausting themselves before reaching the battlefield. They arrived expecting to reinforce a holding action, perhaps to help organize a withdrawal or to strengthen a defensive position. Instead, they were immediately attacked by an enemy that should have been retreating. The cognitive dissonance, the gap between expectation and reality, created a moment of confusion that Harold ruthlessly exploited. Tostig's death removed the last legitimate commander the Norwegians had. Eyjolf Thorson, commanding the reinforcements, was a capable warrior but not a king or earl. He didn't have the authority to rally the entire Norwegian army. The various jarls and chieftains who commanded portions of the force had no clear chain of command and no unified plan. In the confusion and exhaustion of late afternoon battle, the Norwegian army simply disintegrated. The pursuit toward Rickhall became a running slaughter. Medieval warfare made a distinction between battle, where warriors fought in formed units, and pursuit, where victorious armies chased fleeing enemies. Pursuit was when casualties mounted most rapidly. Fleeing warriors couldn't defend themselves effectively. They were exhausted, scattered, often had discarded shields and weapons to run faster. English pursuers, organised in groups, could overtake and kill them at leisure. The 10-mile road from Stamford Bridge to Rickhall became a killing ground. Bodies lined the route. Some Norwegians tried to form defensive positions and were overwhelmed. Others hid in woods or fields and were hunted down. A few made it to the ships and managed to board before the English arrived. Most died on the road, cut down from behind, unable to defend themselves. The casualties at Stamford Bridge were catastrophic, even by medieval standards. Medieval battles rarely killed more than 10 to 20% of combatants. Most casualties occurred during the rout when the losing side broke and ran. But at Stamford Bridge the Norwegians couldn't effectively retreat. The river blocked one route. The distance to the ships made a fighting withdrawal nearly impossible. The result was a killing rate that approached 80%, an extraordinarily high figure. The English casualties, though lower in percentage terms, were still significant. Perhaps 2,000 dead and many more wounded represents nearly 30% casualties, a rate that would break most medieval armies. That Harold's forces remained effective despite these losses speaks to the quality of English military organisation and the morale benefits of defending one's homeland. The immediate aftermath saw Harold dealing with the Norwegian survivors with surprising mercy. Olaf Haraldsson, Harold's son who had remained with the ships at Rickall, was allowed to withdraw with the surviving warriors. They required only 24 ships of the original 300, a ratio that illustrates the scale of the disaster. Harold required oaths that the Norwegians would never return to England in arms, oaths that were kept. Olaf returned to Norway and ruled peacefully for 26 years, never attempting another invasion. This mercy was practical rather than generous. Harold had destroyed the Norwegian military capability for a generation. The survivors posed no threat. Allowing them to leave removed any need to garrison forces in the north and eliminated potential complications from holding Norwegian nobles for ransom. Harold needed his army mobile and ready to respond to other threats. The decision would prove prescient within days. The news from the south reached Harold in York on September 28th, 3 days after Stamford Bridge. William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey on September 28th, with perhaps 7,000 men, including Norman cavalry and archers. The invasion Harold had been expecting all summer, which had seemed to evaporate when favourable winds failed and William's fleet remained in port, had finally materialised at the worst possible moment. Harold's response demonstrated the same decisive leadership he had shown in the march to Stamford Bridge. He immediately ordered his army south. There would be no rest, no time to recover from battle, no opportunity to integrate replacements for the casualties they had taken. The threat to the south was more dangerous than the Norwegian invasion had been. William was a more capable commander than Harald Hardrada, his army better balanced with combined arms, his strategic position stronger. Harold had to move fast. The march south was even more brutal than the march north had been. Harold's men were exhausted from the forced march north, the battle at Stamford Bridge, and the pursuit. They had taken significant casualties. They were now being asked to march 200 miles south at the same breakneck pace they had just completed. Many couldn't do it. Warriors who had fought bravely at Stamford Bridge collapsed on the road south and had to be left behind. Others deserted, returning to their homes rather than face another forced march and battle. By the time Harold reached London, his army was smaller and more exhausted than it had been at Stamford Bridge. The strategic situation Harold faced would have challenged the greatest generals in history. 2 invasions, one from Norway and one from Normandy, timed to stretch English defences beyond breaking. The first invasion defeated at enormous cost in time, casualties, and exhaustion. The second invasion landing precisely when English forces were least able to respond. It was a strategic nightmare with no good options. Modern historians debate whether Harold should have rested in London, gathered more forces from the shires, and allowed his army to recover before facing William. The argument has merit. A week or 2 of rest, combined with reinforcements from southern shires that hadn't participated at Stamford Bridge, might have given Harold a larger and fresher army. But Harold made the same calculation he had made before Stamford Bridge. Speed and surprise were his advantages. William was consolidating his position in Sussex, foraging for supplies, and building fortifications. Every day Harold delayed was a day William's position grew stronger. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, less than 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, would be decided by factors that had their roots in the northern battle. Harold's housecarls, the elite core of his army, had taken casualties at Stamford Bridge that couldn't be replaced. The Fyrd warriors, who had fought brilliantly in Yorkshire, were exhausted from 2 forced marches and 1 major battle in less than a month. The English army at Hastings was tired before the battle started, yet Harold nearly won at Hastings. His defence of Senlac Hill held off Norman attacks for most of the day. Had his exhausted warriors had the reserves of strength to maintain discipline when William's forces feigned retreat, the outcome might have been different. But they didn't have those reserves. Stamford Bridge had consumed them. When the English line finally broke, Harold's forces, exhausted beyond endurance, were overwhelmed. The death of Harold Godwinson at Hastings ended the Anglo-Saxon monarchy and changed English history forever. but his achievement at Stamford Bridge, overshadowed by subsequent defeat, deserves recognition as one of the great military accomplishments of medieval warfare. He marched an army 200 miles in 5 days, achieved complete tactical surprise, defeated a force twice his size led by one of history's legendary warriors, and ended the Viking threat to England permanently. That he couldn't also defeat William of Normandy 3 weeks later reflects the impossible strategic situation he faced, not any failure of military skill or leadership. Stamford Bridge marked the definitive end of an era. The Viking Age, which had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, ended on a Yorkshire battlefield in 1066. The dream of a Scandinavian empire encompassing England, which had been realised briefly under Nut the Great, died with Harald Hardrada. The cultural and military model of the Viking warrior, the individual champion seeking glory through combat, proved unable to compete with the organised military systems of established kingdoms. The legacy of Stamford Bridge lived on in unexpected ways. The Norwegian survivors returned home with stories of English military capability that influenced Scandinavian strategic thinking for generations. Norway and Denmark would continue to look to England, but as trading partners and diplomatic equals rather than as potential conquests. The Viking diaspora, which had created settlements from Iceland to Russia, gradually integrated into the broader European world rather than remaining a separate martial culture. In England, the memory of Stamford Bridge was quickly overshadowed by Hastings and the Norman conquest. The triumphant victory that saved the north became a footnote to the disaster that lost the kingdom. But in Yorkshire, in the communities around Stamford Bridge, the memory persisted. Local traditions maintained that the battlefield was haunted by the ghosts of fallen warriors. Farmers ploughing fields avoided certain areas where, it was said, the ground was still soaked with blood. The bones continued to surface for centuries. In the 1860s, during construction of a railway line near Stamford Bridge, workers uncovered a mass grave containing hundreds of skeletons, many showing evidence of violent death. Broken skulls, severed limbs, bones bearing marks of edged weapons. These were almost certainly casualties from the battle, buried in haste after the fighting ended. The discovery sparked renewed interest in the battle and its significance. Modern archaeology has revealed additional details about the battle and its participants. Excavations near the bridge site have uncovered weapons, armour fragments, and personal items that illuminate daily life and military equipment of the period. Chemical analysis of bones from the mass grave suggests the dead included men from Scandinavia, based on dietary signatures preserved in bone structure. These were Harald Hardrada's warriors, buried far from home after fighting for a king's ambition. The battle's tactical lessons influenced medieval warfare for centuries. The importance of logistics and march discipline, demonstrated by Harold's rapid movement north, became standard teaching in military treatises. The vulnerability of armies caught unprepared, illustrated by the Norwegian disaster, reinforced the necessity of proper reconnaissance and defensive preparation. The effectiveness of coordinated combined arms, with housecarls and fyrd working together, influenced the development of English military organisation. Stamford Bridge also demonstrated the limitations of individual martial prowess in increasingly organised warfare. Harald Hardrada was arguably the finest warrior of his generation, a man who had fought across the known world and never lost a major battle. Yet his lifetime of experience and personal skill couldn't overcome poor strategic positioning and tactical surprise. The age of the warrior hero was giving way to the age of organised armies and professional military systems. The human cost of Stamford Bridge extended far beyond the battlefield casualties. Every dead Norwegian warrior represented a family in Scandinavia that lost a father, son or brother. Every dead English warrior left a widow and orphans. The economic impact on Norway was severe. Losing a generation of military-age men disrupted farming, trade and social structure. English communities in Yorkshire and along the march route suffered their own losses that affected local economies and families for years. The women's perspective, largely absent from chronicles written by and for male warriors, can be partially reconstructed from legal records and church documents. Widows in England gained certain legal rights and properties from their fallen husbands, but faced economic hardship and social challenges. In Norway, women whose men never returned faced similar difficulties, often with less legal protection. The battle created thousands of widows on both sides of the North Sea. For Harold Godwinson, Stamford Bridge represented both his finest hour and the beginning of his doom. The victory demonstrated his exceptional abilities as a military commander and leader of men. The speed of his march, the surprise of his attack, the tactical sophistication of his battle plan, all marked him as one of the great generals of his age. But the victory came at a cost that left him unable to meet the next challenge effectively. One wonders what might have happened if William had landed a month earlier or a month later. If Harold had faced only one invasion, rather than two simultaneous threats, the outcome might have been very different. An England that defeated both Norway and Normandy in 1066 would have been a European superpower. An Anglo-Saxon dynasty that survived might have developed differently than Norman England did. The English language might have evolved without the massive French influence that Norman rule brought. English culture and institutions might have followed different paths. But history deals with what happened, not what might have been. What happened was that Harold Godwinson won the greatest victory of his life at Stamford Bridge, then lost everything at Hastings. The Viking Age ended. The Anglo-Saxon monarchy ended. A new era began. Yet Stamford Bridge remains a monument to what Anglo-Saxon England achieved at its height. A sophisticated military system, effective logistics, disciplined forces, brilliant leadership, all the elements necessary for victory were present. They were simply exhausted by the time they faced William 3 weeks later. The battlefield at Stamford Bridge today is peaceful farmland. A small memorial marks the approximate site where Harold's army caught Harald Hardrada unprepared and destroyed his invasion force. Tourists visit occasionally, drawn by the dramatic story. But mostly it's quiet countryside, giving no hint of the violence that occurred there in 1066. The river flows peacefully under a modern bridge. Sheep graze where warriors once fell by the thousands. Yet the significance of what happened there echoes through history. Stamford Bridge was where Saxon England proved it could defend itself against the greatest external threats of the age. It was where the Viking Age received its death blow. It was where one of history's greatest forced marches delivered one of medieval warfare's most complete victories. That the victorious army was itself destroyed 3 weeks later doesn't diminish the achievement. For one September day in 1066, everything worked perfectly. English military capability, leadership, logistics, tactics, and courage combined to produce triumph. That the triumph couldn't be sustained doesn't make it less real or less remarkable. When Viking axes met Saxon shields at Stamford Bridge, the shields won. That victory saved the North, ended a 250-year threat, and demonstrated what Anglo-Saxon England could achieve. It deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to Hastings, but as a triumph in its own right. The last great battle of the Viking Age, the finest hour of Harold Godwinson, the day Saxon England stood against the storm and prevailed,